Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us present our work here. Without the ERF, Arab Fund, etc., obviously none of this work would have been possible, and the comments from various people from the ERF have been invaluable. This is part of chapter 3 of what Jeff referred to of our project, and mainly deals with one of the key issues that Jeff raised, and I think it's quite important to first establish what is the curse, what is the oil curse in the region, and the sort of the literature, as I will show you, has been saying that there is an unconditional negative effect of oil revenue on growth, economic growth, TFP, capital accumulation, human capital accumulation, etc. And so what we want to do is to see whether this abundance, is it really due to the abundance of oil, or is there some other factors that are driving this curse? And the other thing we would like to do is to see, are there any roles for institutions, fiscal institutions, in offsetting some of these negative effects? So really the key things we will be looking at, and I will show you for this region, is essentially volatility and procyclicality of fiscal policy. Obviously, the Dutch disease phenomena, I'm pretty sure everybody in this room is aware of it. It developed early on and was coined by actually the Economist. It was due to the Dutch discovery of natural gas, which was a huge injection into the economy, but then basically they didn't have much gas left, and so it had some adverse effects on the economy through real exchange rate appreciation, reallocation of resources to the non-tradable sector. But there are other explanations from a political economy point of view which are quite important. So there is a huge literature on corruption, voracity, civil conflict. We are not saying these are not important. What we are saying here is that we're going to look at institutions in terms of fiscal and in terms of monetary institutions rather than trying to get to the political economy issue. But one key thing I want to say is that some of these political economy considerations were recently formalized by colleagues in a special issue of Oxford Economic Papers, and it's quite clear, and we discuss it in our book, it's quite clear that there are, considering political economy, motives, it's not quite clear whether oil is a curse or a blessing. So before, I think, if you think people would try to convince you that from a political economy point of view, oil is bad for this region, with the setup of the monarchies and the rulers. But it's not quite clear that that's the case, and Jeff alluded to it in his talk. And there obviously has been now work on institutions. This became a buzzword in not just in this field, but in many fields and is currently. But the important thing here with these studies is that they show that even abundance of oil is actually bad for you. And then they show that having better institutions might offset some of that abundance curse, let's call it. So what I call the conventional oil curse. So it is still the case, like Sachs and Warner, that once you control for institutions, you do have this curse. But then there is a threshold effect above which, if you have 90 out of 100, then you're Norway. You then can sort of offset this curse. So I'm not going to cover this very much, but most of the empirical support, at least early on, were based on Sachs and Warner's specification. And for those of you who are aware of this literature, it's based on cross-sectional specifications. Now, there are a number of issues with this literature, which we also raise in the book. And one of the things is that when you average things that are important, like volatility, they sort of disappear. So if you think about a business cycle, if you average data, the business cycle disappears. And business cycle is quite important for economic growth. The oil volatility is quite important for economic growth. So, and they do not account for endogeneity and omitted variable problems. But even the homogeneous panels that have been used recently, they're not that good in the sense that they restrict, while they allow for different countries to have different characteristics, so like geographical locations and so on, what they do not allow for is that they say basically the effect of oil revenue on economic growth in Norway is constrained to be exactly the same as it is in Kuwait, as it is in Algeria, which does not seem to fit the data, what we observe. There has been a lot of work, and not to mention that most of the literature actually ignores the effect of volatility. This literature affects the effect of volatility, of revenue volatility on economic growth. And these are some of the things that we'll be discussing. I want to say that most recent literature by colleagues in the fund and the IMF and others have looked at the effects of oil revenue, oil rent and oil production revenue on growth, and have shown, in fact, that this is positively associated with growth. In fact, we have a paper with Hadi Salih Esvani and Hashem Pesseran, where we develop a growth theory, theoretical growth theory for an oil exporter, and show that oil actually is beneficial for economic growth through the capital accumulation channel. And we're working on that with colleagues here at the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. So what I'm going to do quickly, because I have some time for discussion, I want to show you some data, some scatter plots, and then because you will not be convinced and you say, well, that's like cross-sectional specifications, it suffers from endogeneity issues and so on, I will show you some results from estimations that we have done. And what we are essentially arguing, if you're going to shut off now, what we are arguing essentially is that oil abundance in itself is actually not bad for economic growth. What's actually extremely bad, and more so for this region, is the volatile nature of this resource. It's not the price volatility, we will argue, it's the oil revenue volatility. It's the production and the price volatility combined that needs to be taken into account. And we're going to show you that actually from a fiscal point of view, from an institutional point of view, there are measures that can be taken to dampen this negative effect. So just a quick look, the top two graphs show you for oil producers, and the right graph shows you for MENA oil producers the association between oil revenue growth and GDP growth. And you can see a mild positive relationship between the two. In the literature, certainly is not a negative association that you would get. This data is, if available, this data is based on at least 30 consecutive observations, and for a lot of the countries over 4 decades. But what we can see clearly, if you look at the right panel, the second graph, that shows the positive association between oil revenue growth volatility and GDP growth volatility. And what this basically says, the higher oil revenue growth volatility you have, the larger the GDP growth volatility you will have. So you might say, why is that important? It's quite well established now that GDP volatility, now whether it comes from TFP, capital accumulation, wherever it comes from, is extremely bad for economic performance, for GDP growth. And that's what the left panel essentially shows you. Higher GDP growth volatility implies lower GDP growth for these oil producers. And this left panel is nothing revolutionary. In fact, Rami in American Economic Review in 1995 did exactly this, but not looking at oil countries, looked at all countries, and they show you a negative association between this. But what we want to argue, there are 4 key things here, is that what we do is we look at realized oil revenue volatility. That's essentially oil revenue volatility calculated over the year. So we take monthly data on oil production and oil prices for each of these countries. These are country specific. It's not an index, country specific. And we calculate the realized oil revenue volatility. In finance, it's been common for decades. In economics, we rarely use it. But what I want to show from these 2 graphs, Norway is usually taken as the good guy, and Iran, one of the not so good guys perhaps. Kuwait, we could replace it with any of the countries in the region. Saudi Arabia would probably be even worse. But what this really shows, if you look at the solid line, that's the oil price volatility. And if you notice, obviously, until 73, there was very little oil price volatility because the major international oil companies were setting the price. And then, boom, we have the oil price shock of 73, 74, and then again in 78, 79. And then after the collapse of OPEC pricing in 1985, we see that the volatility has been a key feature of the oil prices. But what I want to show you is what's important here is not oil price volatility. What's important here is oil revenue volatility. So to illustrate that, look at the dashed lines. And if you notice, oil production volatility has in fact been much more volatile than oil revenue volatility has been much more volatile than oil price volatility and oil production volatility. It's because of adjustment in in oil production, obviously. So what is key here for these countries is not the oil prices, and we put too much emphasis on oil prices moving up and oil prices moving down. If in fact you can offset that oil price movement, then that's what's important. Or maybe it's oil price movement exacerbates the oil revenue volatility. So really what I want to take away is that we really need to look at oil revenue volatility, not oil price, not oil production. And most of the people who will do anything on oil will look at oil price volatility or commodity price volatility. So, including ourselves actually earlier on. So, if you then look at the realized oil revenue volatility and plot it for the same country, so oil producer versus MENA oil producers, you notice that there is a slight negative association between these two variables. So, between GDP growth and realized oil revenue volatility. Yeah, because you want, I want to show you that this is not just scatter plots, and we've done some econometrics. I'm not going to go through what exactly methods we've done, but the methods we have employed are robust to endogeneity. You can include endogenous variables, exogenous variables, stationary, non-stationary variables. It's robust to cross-sectional dependence, omitted variables, and so on. So what the story tells us from these tables is what the graphs showed you. So if you look at the top row, that shows you the positive effects of oil abundance on economic growth. What's worrying is the second row. It shows you the statistically significant, highly statistically significant, usually at the 1% level, negative association between oil revenue volatility and economic growth. So for a country like Iran, which over the last 3 decades have experienced a 40% oil revenue volatility, what this number shows is that it's shaved off, if you take, for instance, the the last column, second row, it's minus 0.041. It's basically shaved off 1.6% of GDP, real GDP growth. That's massive. That's quite enormous. Think about Norway over the last 30 years. Its real GDP growth has on average been about 2.5%. So 1.6% drop is massive, and this is common in this region. So oil revenue volatility is extremely bad, and obviously this is coupled with procyclicality. The same story holds if you do TFP growth analysis. And this doesn't obviously sit very well with the Dutch disease phenomena, because according to the Dutch disease, oil revenue goes up, oil prices go up, oil production goes up. It crowds out the dynamic, non-resource tradable sector, drops in TFP growth, and then drop in GDP growth. What we're seeing here is that's not the case. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at fiscal policy. And we're going to look at the component of fiscal policy, the discretionary component of fiscal policy, which has nothing to do with the business cycle, which has nothing to do with smoothing the short-term impacts. And that's what we call fiscal policy volatility. So here, what we've done is we've taken fiscal policy volatility, we widened the group of countries here to also minerals, so Chile and also natural gas and not just oil. And if you plot these countries that are major, so more than 50% of their total exports are primary commodities. And if you look at the fiscal policy volatility measure and you look at the GDP growth volatility measure, you notice that they're quite nicely related. In a bad way. Higher fiscal policy volatility. What does fiscal policy volatility mean? It basically means that I change policy because of maybe my own political preferences. As an example, you change policy to keep people happy. So following the Arab Spring, we noticed that there was huge increases in public sector wages. There was huge increases in social welfare packages. So that sort of expenditure, and that has really extremely bad effect on GDP growth volatility. I can show you also the relationship between weak institutions and fiscal policy volatility. So if you look at it, what we're talking about really here is that one needs to have better institutions. One needs to have institutions that can enforce the budgets. Needs to have institutions that can evaluate the programs. And if you look at the institutional quality, the worse the institutional quality is, the higher the fiscal policy volatility we experience. And if I zoom that out from primary commodity exporters and say, well, maybe for oil that's not the case. In fact, you notice for oil is probably worst case. So high fiscal policy volatility associated with low institutional quality. And so finally, before I finish, I want to show you what we do is now is the top row shows you the negative effect of oil revenue volatility, which we saw before. But the second row now shows you what would happen if this institutional quality actually increased. So we moved from 0 to 100. And what you notice here that an increase in this fiscal institution, increase in institutions in general will reduce this volatile nature of the resources, and that will dampen this negative effect. So really the key to be taken away from here is that institutional quality higher institutional quality, lower fiscal policy volatility, and lower oil revenue volatility can have a much positive impact on the economies in this region. These are quite substantial numbers for Iran, as I said, 1.6% drop in real GDP growth. So if you read the paper, if you read the chapter, what we're trying to argue for is that really one should not, oil can be either a curse or a blessing. It really has to do with how you manage this resource. It has to do with how you insulate the economy from this resource. And sovereign wealth funds in the region has done a good job, and Jeff talked about that. But really, it's not done enough. The domestic expenditure is very volatile in this region, and that leads to a higher volatility in GDP, which in turn reduces the growth rate of the region. I don't like to take Norway as an example usually because Norway is very different, but what the Norwegian system, Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, if you like, the government pension fund, what they call now, has done is to do two things. People usually think about it as a sovereign wealth fund. It's not just concerned with intergenerational equity. It's also concerned with smoothing the cycle. And that's why I think the first component in this region, the sovereign wealth funds, have worked well, although the proportion that Kuwait puts in is quite small. But the second part is where we're having a problem in the region, and that exacerbates the resource, the curse. So what we're arguing for is that you need to have a better management of the oil revenue. You need to insulate the economy from this volatility, and one of the ways we've talked about is through sovereign wealth funds or smoothing the cycle would be, or stabilization funds. It doesn't have to be a sovereign wealth fund. Stabilization fund, which is what Norway is, a mix between sovereign wealth fund and stabilization fund, is to basically complement expenditure, whether it's in human capital, whether it's in physical capital, and also to develop, we talked about financial sector. The reason why these countries in our region is so volatile is because of capital market absorption is very small. So when we get a shock to the economy moves down like a yo-yo. So, but if we did have better financial markets and individuals could insure, then we could have a much higher prosperity in the region. I should stop there.